Sherlock Holmes and the Christmas Eve Monster Chase. Chapter 1, The Bells in the Cold Night. Beneath the thickest layer of snow lies a secret that every hearth fears to mention. The first snowstorm of winter swept through the village of Grimswell like an old soul returning. The wind howled through every crack in the doors, brushed against moss-covered rooftops, and sighed atop the ancient church spire. When the clock struck 12, the church bells rang out into the Christmas night. But that night, they carried no prayer or message of peace. It was a warning. At that moment, old George Merrow, the village's longtime grain keeper, was walking home from his granddaughter's house. He was a tough man, having survived 3 brutal winters and a bout of tuberculosis. But this time, as he passed the old cemetery, he heard something, dragging. Something heavy, sliding across the snow, making a screeching sound like metal scraping against frozen stone. He stopped, listened. Then his aged eyes widened. Far off among the black pines, between the white snow and the dark, was a giant creature. Neither man nor beast. A hulking form covered in thick, pitch-black fur, with legs long as a giraffe's but hunched low, crawling on all fours. What made George freeze wasn't the figure's shape. It was its eyes. 2 glowing pits of red, like burning coals, silently watching the night. It was dragging something behind it. A body, limp, sliding across the snow. George tried to cry out, but his throat locked up. By the time he caught his breath, the creature had vanished into the woods. The next morning, snow had buried the old path. George arrived at the police station, pale and shaken. At first, the patrolman thought he'd mistaken a tree's shadow or been frightened by Christmas wine. But when it was discovered that Henry Prowell, the traveling merchant, had not returned from his late-night delivery run, everyone fell silent. Henry's wife came in weeping, saying her husband had left the village in the afternoon to deliver gifts and never came back. In her hands was a red wool scarf, a gift she had knitted herself to give him that Christmas Eve. Some children claimed they had heard a howl the night before, coming from the woods. Not quite human, yet stretched and hollow, as if echoing from the earth's depths. The police formed a search party. The snow was thick, erasing all tracks. But near the edge of the forest, they found something unexplainable, a long drag mark in the snow, as wide as a human body, mingled with tracks, not human, and not from any known forest animal. They had claws. Big ones. And very deep. Inspector Garrett, head of the investigation, trembled as he stepped out of the forest. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but what he saw made him send an urgent letter to London. The recipient was none other than Sherlock Holmes. On Baker Street, snow fell soft as powdered sugar. People hurried through the streets carrying trees, wine, and gifts home. No one knew that, in apartment 221B, a letter had just been placed on the table. Holmes stood before the fireplace, violin in hand, playing notes as cold and piercing as the winter wind. I, Dr. Watson, was writing up a case we had just wrapped up the week before when the door opened. Mrs. Hudson came in with an envelope sealed with wax bearing the imprint of a pine tree. Holmes opened it, eyes narrowing as he read the first lines. Grimswell Village. Christmas night, a massive creature, eyes red as fire, dragging a man into the forest. Before I could ask anything, Holmes spoke, his voice as even as the wind sweeping across the moors. We have a visitor waiting. And it seems this year, the monster has chosen the right night to return. I had never heard of Grimswell. A small northern village, nearly forgotten by the world. Holmes pulled out a map, located it, and looked at me with a sharp, icy gaze. The local police won't solve this. They're not tracking the monster's footprints, they're looking at the wrong monster. The earliest train took us out of London the next morning. As the iron wheels screeched along the rails, I felt as though we were leaving reason behind and entering a place of mist, where truth lay buried under snow, and the monster might well be a man. That night, in Grimswell, the church bells rang once more. But this time, it wasn't the priest who rang them. They found frozen blood beneath the bell tower. And on the rope that rang the bell hung a piece of red wool scarf, torn in two. The other half lay beneath the snowy forest, where the darkness was thicker than any Christmas star could pierce. Chapter 2, A Summons in Winter. Mysteries never walk into the light on their own, they always require an invitation from the darkest place. It was a grey, snowy morning in London. The street lamp still flickered faintly, not yet extinguished, when a man in a cloak soaked with mist stood outside the door of 221B Baker Street. His hand clutched a letter, trembling from both the cold and from something else, something he wasn't sure he could believe. Just a few minutes later, in a room warmed by a coal fire and faintly scented with coffee, Holmes silently read the letter while I observed his eyes, no longer absent-minded as usual, but tightening with each line. The letter was from Father Thomas Rylance, the priest of St. Elwyn's Church in Grimswell. Unlike the previous message from the police, this one bore a different tone, a suppressed plea cloaked in the language of faith. Father Rylance spoke of howls at midnight, drawn-out cries like the wailing of lost souls. Of the stench of sulfur rising around the church though no fire had burned. And of footprints, twice the size of a man's, stamped deep into the cold snow, starting at the graveyard and ending at the church's back door. The priest no longer felt sure what he was fighting. He wrote that if the scriptures had ever spoken of demons, then whatever lurked in Grimswell was surely one of them. Holmes put the letter down and sat in silence for a long moment. Then he rose, retrieving his scarf and gloves. "We're going. Not just because we've been summoned, but because I sense what's happening in Grimswell goes far beyond a mere disappearance." The train left London before dawn. Through the condensation-streaked windows, white fields drifted by, receding into the distance. Snow fell without end, as though the sky itself sought to erase all trace of human reason. I asked Holmes if he truly believed there was something supernatural in Grimswell. He replied that in all the cases he had solved, the most frightening thing was never the ghost, but the person behind it. Yet what had caught his attention wasn't the sulfur, but the footprints. Holmes opened a sketch sent by Father Rylance. A rough but clear drawing that showed footprints with 3 long, hooked toes, like the claws of a nocturnal predator. More important still was the stride length, very wide, suggesting a creature at least 2 meters tall. "We are not hunting ghosts. We are hunting something, or someone, that knows how to wield fear as a weapon. And uses Christmas Eve as the perfect disguise." Grimswell emerged from the snow like a forgotten painting. A tiny village nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by dense forest and snowy hills. Every home had smoke rising from the chimneys, but the windows were shuttered, the curtains heavy. There were no children playing. No carols. Father Rylance greeted us with sunken eyes, hollowed from sleepless nights. Beneath the priest's robes was a gaunt frame and the hesitant manner of a man who had witnessed something that contradicted everything he had ever believed. He led us to St. Elwyn's Church, a black stone structure built in the medieval era. Above the entrance was a cross with one corner broken off, and the wooden doors bore long scratches as if clawed at. The smell of sulfur was real, faint, but unmistakable. Not like fireworks, but like something heated from deep underground, mingled with smoke and blood. In the sanctuary, where candles flickered and wreaths still hung, a row of pews had been pushed aside. In the dim light, Holmes knelt down and found what I hadn't noticed, faint claw marks across the wooden floor, as though someone, or something, had crawled through. Father Rylance told us the howling had begun 3 nights ago, precisely at midnight. On the second night, he heard footsteps circling the church. On the third, he saw a large shadow standing outside the stained glass window, and the next morning, there were footprints, and the stench of sulfur. No one had seen the creature's face clearly. But a village boy claimed he had seen red eyes in the forest and heard it repeating a word, not English. Like a hiss, but with rhythm. Holmes requested to be taken to the graveyard. Snow covered the headstones, rendering the place quieter than the chapel itself. At the western corner, where Father Rylance pointed, Holmes knelt and brushed away the snow, reaching into the soft soil. It seemed someone had recently dug and hastily filled it back in. A disturbed grave. Not by wild animals. Holmes said nothing more, only instructed that the area be preserved and that no one was to approach it. Back at the rectory, he told me. We are dealing with a person. Or several. But they don't kill simply to kill, they are constructing a legend. A nightmare for Christmas, to conceal something far deeper. That night, we stayed in Father Rylance's parlor. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the doors like the sighs of a forgotten world. At the stroke of midnight, the church bell rang. No one had pulled the rope. And then the howling began. Long, mournful, like a death knell from a century past. Holmes opened his eyes wide and whispered. He's returned. Tonight, we'll hear the voice of the devil, and follow its trail until the truth is revealed. I stood at the window, staring out into the pitch-black forest. And there, far away, between two bare trees, glimmered two red lights. Not lanterns. Not reflections. Eyes. Waiting. Chapter 3, The Cursed Village. Every candle lit in fear is a sign that darkness has ruled for far too long. From the moment we stepped into Grimswell, Holmes noticed one thing: no one ventured outside after sunset. There were no sounds of laughter, no Christmas bells ringing, not even curious glances for strangers. Only shuttered windows, and behind the glass, flickering candlelight like spirits suspended between life and death. We rented a small room at the inn on the edge of the village. The innkeeper was an old woman named Mildred. Her eyes cloudy, her hands trembling, but her words were precise, as though carved into her memory over the years. When she heard Holmes's name, she simply nodded, not surprised, as if she had been expecting this for a long time. Holmes asked about the candles in the village. Mrs. Mildred glanced toward the window, where the snow was falling thickly like a white curtain dividing two worlds. The people of Grimswell believe that candles are the only thing that can keep the monster's spirit from entering a house. Not lighting one is an invitation. Not locking your door is choosing the fate of those who dared to raise their heads during the cursed night. The tale of the Christmas Eve monster did not begin with the recent disappearance. It was a legend older than the village itself, passed down through generations like a crack running beneath the stone foundation. According to the story, on Christmas Eve centuries ago, a man was burned alive in the middle of Grimswell Square. His crime was unclear. All that was known was that the villagers at the time called him a heretic, someone who could summon demons. When the fire died down, it was said that nothing remained of him but his eyes, still burning red. And from then on, every winter, as the coldest night approached, heavy footsteps echoed through the woods. Those who dared to laugh on that night would not live to see morning. Holmes said nothing. He only asked, "So someone dies every year?" Mrs. Mildred was silent. Then she said that not every year saw a murder, but in years when snow fell before Christmas Eve, someone often went missing. No one asked questions. No one searched. The police had come once, but stayed only one night before leaving, their room at the inn stained with the lingering scent of sulfur. I wrote this in my notebook, while Holmes rose and stepped out, staring at the village square, where a tall, neglected pine tree stood without decorations or lights, just a bare trunk in the snow. He murmured, almost to himself. Where death begins, darkness always returns to claim the living. The next morning, we walked through the village, speaking to a few residents willing to crack their doors open. No one would speak in detail, but all of them knew. A man named Ewan, the village's oldest blacksmith, said that his father once told him about being chased by the monster in the forest. It had a man's body but beast's legs, with arms so long they hung past its knees, and when it screamed, the snow around its tracks would melt. Someone else told of a young girl who, a few years ago, dared to go out on Christmas Eve, scoffing at superstitions. The next morning, they found her shoes sunken deep in the snow, in the middle of the woods. No body, only drag marks. Holmes quietly recorded every detail. Then he asked a question that brought silence to everyone. "Has anyone ever seen the monster's face?" No one answered. But a child named Samuel, about 9 years old, tugged on my coat when Holmes had walked ahead. The boy whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw it. It's not human. But not an animal either. Its face looked like a dead man's. And it spoke a language, wasn't human speech. Like wind. Like fire." When I told Holmes, he simply nodded, unsurprised. He had suspected all along, the legend was a cover. And every cover is made to hide something. That evening, we returned to the inn. Mrs. Mildred brought Holmes an item wrapped in old cloth, a tattered leather notebook bearing a skewed cross and a faded Latin inscription. She said it was the keepsake of the former priest who had lived in Grimswell before Father Rylance. The man had vanished 30 years ago, during a winter filled with howling. The notebook was a journal, written in hurried, looping script, describing an ancient rite once performed in Grimswell during the Middle Ages. An exorcism ritual gone wrong. One that, instead of banishing a demon, tore open a fissure between two realms. And the man who was burned alive all those years ago, he might not have been a heretic. He may have been a sacrifice. After reading it, Holmes's expression darkened. He looked out the window, where the snow was falling heavier by the hour. He said, if Grimswell were a stage, then someone had rewritten the old script and was now reenacting it, with blood, with fear, and with legends that no one dared to question anymore. And he believed, the legend of the Christmas Eve monster wasn't meant to scare. It was a tongue without a mouth. Someone stood behind it, giving it words, creating the howls, the footprints, the shadow, so they could kill without ever showing themselves. At midnight, the village candles were lit once more. Holmes did not sleep. He sat by the table, leafing through the old notebook. I asked him what he thought of the legend. Holmes replied, "Whenever people believe in a demon, there is always someone hiding in the shadows who gains power from that belief. And if a real monster exists, then it is the person who has used this legend to manipulate an entire village for 100 years. Outside, the wind howled furiously. And in that moment, I heard it, not the wailing. But the footsteps. Heavy. Long. Even. Scraping through the snow. Something was walking around the village. Not a legend. But reality." Chapter 4, Bloody Footprints in the Snow. Every footprint left behind is not merely a trace of the culprit, but a memory resurrected from the past, one that people have tried to bury. Just as dawn broke and the snow had yet to melt, Holmes stepped out of the inn, leading me along a narrow path toward the forest north of Grimswell village. Father Rylance had shown us the location where the last missing person was seen. He dared not accompany us. The priest's eyes were still haunted from the night before, after hearing howls echoing past the church windows, and from the smell of sulfur that had seeped into his vestments. The forest lay under a thick blanket of snow, like a white shroud untouched by human steps. But Holmes did not follow the usual trail. He stopped at a point where 3 gnarled trees twisted upward like the fingers of the dead reaching for the sky. He pointed to the snow. And I saw it, a footprint. It could not be human. Nearly 2 handspans long, the mark was misshapen, claw-like. Irregular. Some claw tips had sunk deep into the snow, as if slicing it while moving. More terrifying still, at the center of the indentation, there was a dark red smear. Blood. Holmes said nothing, simply crouched to the ground and measured the distance between the prints with his hand. I stepped back, not from fear, but from the sensation that the air around us had thickened. Something had passed through here during the night. Not legend. A physical being. The footprints wound deeper into the woods, twisting like the trail of a predator. And then they stopped at a large moss-covered boulder. Behind it, a narrow crevice revealed itself, tight, dark, and clammy. Branches near the entrance were snapped clean, as if something large had forced its way through. Holmes used his cane to sweep away the snow at the entrance. Beneath the ice was a fresh bloodstain, not yet fully frozen. He paused, frowning. I understood then. This sign meant that the creature, or whoever was behind it, had dragged something in here not long ago. We both stooped and entered the crevice. Inside was a small cavern, its jagged stone walls cold as the belly of a dead beast. But what chilled me most was not the damp, but what was etched into the wall. A symbol. Not a word. Not a recognizable drawing. It was a pattern of curved lines interwoven like a spider's web, centered around a single large eye, roughly the size of a human eye, but with 6 slits radiating outward from the center. Like the eye of a reptile. Like something watching from another world. Holmes reached out and touched the symbol. He furrowed his brow, then took out a cloth and wiped away the dust and moss around it. Beneath the grime was a ring of smaller markings, repeating in a circle around the central eye. I asked him if it was an ancient script. Holmes replied no. It did not belong to any known writing system he had seen. But something about the arrangement reminded him of a kind of cipher, as if people from long ago had left behind a message not meant for ordinary eyes, but for those who knew how to see past the facade of myth. We turned to leave the cave, but before we did, Holmes noticed the most unsettling detail: there were no footprints leading out. The massive prints led in. But none led out. Either the creature was still somewhere deeper inside. Or it had no need for feet to leave this place. At the forest's edge, Holmes looked back one last time. His expression was no longer purely analytical, it was intuitive. A kind of intuition I had only seen once before, when we faced Moriarty, the awareness of a master strategist. He said to me, "The symbol in the cave is the first piece of the puzzle. The legends of Grimswell are not fabrications. But they've been warped. Someone has been using fear as fuel, and now they're operating some ancient mechanism using blood, symbols, and disappearances." I asked, "Then who is it?" Holmes replied, "The only one who didn't light a candle last night. The only one who doesn't fear the dark. And the only one who has been inside that cave before." I looked at him, and I realized whom Holmes was referring to. Father Rylance. The priest of Grimswell. But if the priest knows this secret, why did he send a letter pleading for help? Or was that, in fact, the bait? And if that is true, then this coming Christmas Eve, it's not just legend that will awaken, but a ritual, once sealed away, that is now being revived with human blood. Chapter 5, The Voice in the Wind. Whenever laughter rings out from where no one is present, the one who hears it is no longer living fully in this world, but has crossed into the fragile threshold between this realm and another. That morning, snow blanketed the rooftops of Grimswell. The dim sunlight was far too feeble to chase away the deep chill that seemed to settle into the very marrow of one's bones. Holmes gestured for us to split up and investigate the area around the victim's home. He followed the fence behind the house, while I chose the path that led up a small slope into the nearby pine forest. The trees rustled softly, as if something, or someone, were gliding past them. But when I turned my head, all was still. I pressed on, my steps sinking lightly into the snow. The air was thick with a sharp, pungent scent, neither the smell of damp earth nor of rotting wood. It carried something else, something that stirred memories of a hospital, the sterile tang of disinfectant mixed with the long-dried scent of old blood. Suddenly, a faint sound drifted by on the wind. Laughter. Very light. Very clear. And strangely enough, it was the laughter of a child. I stopped in my tracks, listening. Again. The giggling rose and fell among the trees, threading through the icy air as if the wind itself had given birth to it. I moved quickly toward the source of the sound, my heart pounding. Not from fear, but from the sense that I was hearing something that should not be heard. Then, all at once, the laughter ceased. As if someone had placed a hand over the child's mouth, silencing it. I stood alone in the forest, no footprints, no people. Only the wind and the swaying branches, mocking my presence with their rustling. I turned back, heavy with questions that had no answers. When I returned, Holmes was standing beside a large pine tree in front of the victim's house. He motioned for me to come closer. In the snow, he had uncovered a broken branch. It had been cut, the severing clean and sharp, not snapped by snow, but sliced, as if with a blade. I told him about the laughter I had just heard. Holmes was silent, eyes contemplative. He pointed to the tree trunk, where a charred mark formed an irregular circle, as though someone had used that very branch to light a ritual fire. Beside it, on the ground, the snow had melted into the shape of a six-pointed star, its center marked by a dark stain, ash, or perhaps blood. Holmes murmured. That cut wasn't made for firewood. It was deliberate. The Christmas pine, in ancient belief systems, symbolized the link between the world of the living and the spiritual realm. If this branch was taken for a ritual, then whoever did it understood those old traditions well. Or is deliberately trying to reenact them in a twisted form. I asked what he thought of the laughter I had heard. He didn't answer immediately, but drew from his coat a crumpled old piece of paper, taken from the cave earlier. In the daylight, he showed me a small symbol beneath the serpent eye, a child, smiling, standing in the middle of a ring of fire. Holmes said. Perhaps the curse in Grimswell didn't begin with an adult. But with a child. Or at the very least, with the soul of a child that was never laid to rest. I felt a chill run down my spine. Not from the snow, but from the realization that what I had heard might not have been a sign of life. It might have been the echo of a long-buried tragedy. Holmes lifted his gaze toward the woods, the very place I had just come from. He said. That laughter was not meant for ordinary ears. It was a warning. Or a summons. And if we don't act swiftly, the next child won't just laugh in the wind. They'll vanish into the snow. Like so many other souls once called by name beneath the candlelight of Christmas. Chapter 6, Whispers from the Dark. Some secrets do not die with time. They lie dormant in the shadows, waiting for someone bold enough to step in, and awaken the curse still smoldering beneath a veil of holiness. Evening fell over Grimswell like a morning shroud draped across every trace of life. The wan sun had hidden behind heavy gray clouds, and the wind howled in bursts, like the lament of a forgotten century. Holmes and I made our way toward the old church at the end of the rugged cobblestone road, a place where the bells had long fallen silent, yet still echoed with the memory of something lost. The wooden door of the church stood ajar, creaking gently as if unsure whether to invite or warn. Holmes pushed it open, the hinges groaned dryly. Inside was a darkened space, faintly lit by the flicker of a few low candles near the altar. Not a single footstep, not a prayer, only a dense silence wrapping every corner like the funeral veil of a corpse long kept in a cold crypt. We headed to the side archive room of the church, where old prayer books and sacred items were usually stored. There, Holmes found a Bible with its spine deliberately slit open, lying out of place on the shelf. It was coated in dust, but fresh fingerprints marred the cover. Holmes opened it to the last page. There were no gospel verses left. Only a single line, scribbled in ink turned brown with age, like dried blood from an ancient rite. The lost shall return in the form of the demon. I read the line again, a chill creeping down my spine. In the room's dim light, a candle wavered, casting on the wall the silhouette of a faceless figure, long, distorted, as if it had been there long before we entered. Holmes said nothing, only studied the inked words, then turned to the doorway. A shadow had just slipped past. We immediately stepped out, following the stone corridor toward the priest's quarters. Inside, an elderly man with a stooped back and evasive eyes was leafing through a notebook. His name was Father Merrin, the oldest priest in Grimswell, rumored by villagers to have survived all 3 previous appearances of the monster. When Holmes entered, the man did not rise. His clouded eyes flicked toward us, then down again, pretending to read. Holmes sat across from him, speaking directly. "You've read the words in the Bible. You know what they mean. And you're afraid to speak of it." Father Merrin remained silent. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen. His aged hand gripped the corner of the notebook, revealing a scorched scar that ran from his wrist to the back of his hand, an old wound, but one clearly marked by fire, perhaps from some forgotten rite. Holmes spoke again, more softly this time. "How many have returned, in forms that were no longer their own, Father?" The old man looked up, his lips barely moving. His voice was almost a whisper of breath. 3. Then he turned away, as though one more second of eye contact would force the truth out of him. Holmes did not press further. He stood, heading for the door, leaving behind only one final remark. When night falls, the curse will no longer hide in the pages of Scripture. It will take shape in the flesh of those who once denied the truth. Back at the inn, Holmes sat for hours in silence, hand carefully redrawing the final line from the Bible beside the symbol we'd seen in the cave, a ring of fire, with a human figure burning at its center. I asked what he thought of Father Merrin's words. Holmes replied curtly. "He is not afraid of the monster. He is afraid of his own past. And the monster, it did not come from the deep woods. It is something the people of Grimswell created themselves. Then buried beneath prayers. But now, the wind has begun to whisper them again. And the darkness is listening." Chapter 7, The Woman with the Dead Eyes. Not all those who lose their minds are victims. Some minds are crushed by things the rational cannot even dare to name. Morning in Grimswell sank beneath a layer of fog as thick as condensed milk. The landscape blurred like a watercolor soaked through, rendering the already silent village more ghostly than ever. Holmes and I left the inn, following the directions given by Father Merrin the previous evening, toward the edge of the village, where a sagging house stood at the forest's rim, as though shunned by the world itself. The villagers called it Agnes's house, home to a madwoman everyone avoided. She had once served as a maid in the household of the first victim. Since that fateful Christmas Eve, she hadn't uttered a complete sentence, only garbled fragments, and sometimes screamed into the night as though conversing with spirits hiding behind the rotting wooden walls. The door stood ajar, and a stale scent of mildew and old ashes hit us. Bundles of dried herbs tied with red string hung from the walls, perhaps charms for warding off evil, or desperate signs of a soul crying out in fear. In a corner, amid a heap of tattered blankets, sat Agnes, hunched, her eyes wide and vacant like the glass eyes of a doll whose soul had fled. I stepped closer when she suddenly looked up. Her face was lined and withered, hair as white as cinders, but it was her eyes, those dead eyes, that chilled me to the bone. Not because they lacked life, but because they looked through me, as though gazing at something else standing just behind my shoulder. She began to mumble, her tone slow and rhythmic, like a corrupted nursery rhyme. It came back, on the final night, it returned from the snow. She repeated the line, louder each time, as though each utterance tore open a deeper wound in her memory. Holmes didn't look at her. He was examining the room in silence, noting every detail, a spilled inkwell, a candle burned down to the base, and finally, a picture frame draped in white cloth, face down against the wall. He gently turned it over. What we saw made me instinctively take a step back. It was not a typical drawing. The colors were made of ash, charcoal, and perhaps dried blood. The image was of a creature standing in the pine forest. The head of a wolf with jagged teeth, a tall humanoid body covered in gray fur, and on its head, a Santa Claus hat, stained a deep red like wine gone sour. Its hand held a torn sack, and inside were tiny curled-up figures, children, perhaps, or something far worse. Holmes stared at the painting for a long while, saying nothing. His eyes looked as though he were listening to a melody only he could hear. I asked who had painted it. Holmes turned his gaze to Agnes. She was smiling. A vacant smile, but perhaps also a strangely triumphant one, as though the painting was the only proof of a truth the world refused to believe. And then she repeated her line. It came back, on the final night. Holmes covered the painting again, set it gently down, then leaned close to whisper in her ear. He didn't ask a question. He simply said, "I know you kept another one." Agnes stopped smiling. For the first time, her eyes were not vacant, but trembling, like a still pond disturbed by a midnight wind. She pointed to the ceiling. We climbed to the attic. It was dark as the inside of a cave, with only a sliver of light breaking through a hole in the roof tiles. On the wooden floor was an old chest, the lock broken. Holmes opened it. Inside were more drawings, each depicting the same creature, but increasingly grotesque, soaked in blood, surrounded by fire licking at its claws, and in one image, it stood before a church, howling up into the sky on Christmas Eve. Holmes took that one, folded it carefully. When we stepped outside the house, the fog had lifted. But the wind had risen again. And somewhere in the gusts, I thought I heard a child's laughter, mingled with the crackling of pine branches being whipped by the breeze. Holmes slowed his steps, speaking as if to himself. That creature is not merely a fear. It is the distillation of something repressed, fed and nurtured through each winter season. And perhaps Agnes was not the only one who ever saw it. I asked. You think it's real? Holmes didn't respond right away. But then, in a low voice, he said, "What's truly terrifying is not the monster made flesh. It's when everyone in the village knows of it. And remains silent." That night, I couldn't sleep. For in my dreams, I saw the red-hatted wolf standing in the middle of Grimswell. It did not snarl. It only watched me. And smiled. Chapter 8, The Waxen Fingers. The more intricate the crime, the more horrifying it becomes, for the perpetrator is no longer merely a murderer, but an artist painting a ritual in blood and fear. That afternoon, as the fog finally lifted and the snow ceased to fall, the bells of Grimswell Church rang out in an unusually long, somber peal. It was not a call of joy, nor one of prayer. It was a signal passed down from the villagers' ancestors, rung only when a body was found. Watson and I hurried after the panicked cries of a young shepherd boy. He led us to the northern edge of the woods, where an ancient oak stretched skyward like the clawed hand of some demon against the white snow. And there, the second body was revealed. The victim was a middle-aged man, later identified as Mr. Whitlow, a coal deliveryman who served the entire Grimswell region. His corpse hung upside down from a tree branch, his head slumped close to the trunk, as if the weight of his own body were forcing his organs to drain upward into his skull. The most horrifying part was his hands. Both of them had been completely deboned. The skin and flesh remained intact, but were limp and sagging, like empty gloves. Inside was no blood, but instead, segments of aromatic wax shaped like fingers, scented with cinnamon, ginger, and that pungent, spicy note of traditional Christmas spices, evoking memories of sweet gingerbread we had once enjoyed in childhood festivals. I gagged. Holmes did not. He was always like that, composed, as though he had already seen all the vilest things the world had to hide. He examined everything from the base of the tree to the high branches, noting drag marks, boot prints, and finally, a small symbol carved into the snow directly beneath the dangling corpse, a circle enclosing a six-pointed star, with a burning eye drawn at its center. Watson looked at me with terror in his eyes. I could only nod faintly, as though sighing at a darkness far beyond our imagining. Holmes whispered, voice low like a prayer. The killer is performing a ritual. We instructed the villagers not to touch the body until the investigation was complete. But more disturbing was their reaction. No one wept, no one screamed. Only resigned eyes, eyes that suggested this was a fate they had come to expect, as though losing someone whenever snow blanketed the earth was a familiar curse. Holmes returned to the inn carrying one of the wax segments from the victim's hand and placed it beneath his microscope. I didn't want to look again, but he called me over. This isn't ordinary wax. It's mixed with ground human bone ash, nutmeg seeds, and rosewood oil, a compound used in ancient necromantic rituals. I was speechless. He continued. What's alarming is the craftsmanship. This is no longer about concealment or revenge. This is a process. A ritual being carefully completed. I asked, for what purpose? He replied curtly. To summon. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again. But this time, amid the white, there was a faint smear of red. Not blood. Wax. Someone had placed small wax candles in a circle on the inn's doorstep. Holmes stepped outside, crouched, and examined them. The wax ring matched exactly the diagram beneath Whitlow's body. At the center was a scrap of paper, ink smudged black, with a message. The first finger. The second night. The promise is being kept. He turned to me, eyes gleaming with the intensity one only saw when he began to connect disparate pieces into a coherent whole. We're not just chasing a murderer. We've stepped into the middle of an ancient ritual. And the one presiding over it, be it man or something else, is playing a game with every soul in its path. A chill ran down my spine. Not just because of what was happening, but because I was beginning to realize. Every part of this ritual breathed the spirit of Christmas. But not the Christmas of children and joy. This was Christmas for a demon in a red hat. And the game had only just begun. Chapter 9, The Reversed Christmas Hymn. When a sacred melody is dragged backward through the blade of darkness, it ceases to be music, it becomes a silent summons from beyond the realm of the dead. Holmes bent over an old wooden table in the victim's cold, lifeless house. The room was so quiet I could hear the sound of my own breath echoing inside my head. Outside the window, melted snow dripped in slow, steady drops, forming a rhythm like the sound of time itself bleeding out. On the table lay a music box, brass-plated iron, weathered and scratched. Engraved on its lid was the image of a wing-folded angel clutching a broken laurel wreath. Holmes carefully opened the box. A gear gave a faint creak. Then came the sound, not the usual sweet tones of a Christmas carol, but a rendition of Ave Maria. Played in reverse. Each note sounded like the slow, deliberate footstep of someone returning from the depths of hell. It was no hymn, but a moan hidden within the light. I shuddered. Holmes said nothing. He closed his eyes, listening intently to the entire piece. Then he placed a finger on the edge of the box and turned the gear in the opposite direction. The melody changed instantly, elongated, stuttering, even warped like the cry of a strangled child. When the music finally ceased, the air seemed to freeze. No more wind, no more dripping water. Only a silence so unnatural it felt suffocating. Holmes murmured. Not a coincidence. This is a key. I asked, a key to what? He replied. Perhaps the ritual to open a door. We returned to the inn after night had fully fallen. Snow was thick, and the cold wind whipped our faces like lashes. That bizarre melody still haunted me, echoing in my ears as if it had left a trace, a sound that refused to fade. As we crossed the threshold, Holmes halted. His raised hand signaled me at once. Something was wrong. He stepped inside slowly, each footfall measured, as if calculating the distance to danger. The lamp still burned, but the room felt distorted, not from the light, but because something unseen was bending the very sense of reality. A faint hiss broke the silence. I turned, just in time to glimpse a shadow streak past the edge of the window, swift as a gust of freezing wind. A claw sliced through the air. A searing pain tore across my shoulder. I fell, blood soaking through my wool sweater. Holmes rushed to me, pushed me behind the bookcase. He drew his revolver and fired into the darkness. The gunshots cracked, ricocheting off the wooden walls like choked screams. The shadow did not fall. It vanished through the window as if it had never been. We sat in silence, shrouded in the dark. I looked at my bloodied hand. The wound was deep but not fatal. I was alive. Holmes handed me a roll of gauze, dressing the wound as he muttered. "It didn't come to kill you. It came to leave a mark." I asked. "What is it?" Holmes gazed out the window, where the snow was falling gently like flakes of ash. "Not human. Not entirely a monster, either. It's the result of a process. A ritual. A lost will, summoned back." He was silent for a moment, then added. "And the one who summoned it, is still playing." I shivered again. Not just from the cold, but because I now understood. That melody, reversed, had awakened something that did not belong to this world. And now, it knew our faces. Chapter 10, The Secret of the Winter Cavern. Secrets often lie in the shadows of places few dare to tread, and on a frigid winter's night, the deep mysteries of Grimswell Cavern come alive more than ever. Holmes stood before the mouth of the cavern, his flashlight casting a beam onto the damp stone walls covered in ancient moss, forming eerie shapes. The space was shrouded in darkness, and the breath of the rocks felt like whispers of long-forgotten tales. Each of Holmes's footsteps echoed against the cold stone floor, reaching into secrets thought to be buried by time. An engraved symbol on the cavern wall made him stop. It was an image of a circle of fire encircling a serpent with a dragon-like head, its tail touching the flames, a primordial sign never before seen in any known manuscript. Holmes examined the intricate carvings carefully under the flashlight. From his coat pocket, he drew out an old tome and flipped to the section on lost cults. As he turned the pages, a faint smile appeared. This was the mark of the worshippers of the flame, a mysterious sect that once thrived in this region over 2 centuries ago. The cult was wiped out following a gruesome incident involving blood rites and rituals condemned by the local church. Records mention that the cult leader, a man with a name cloaked in darkness, vanished without a trace on Christmas Eve exactly 200 years ago. Holmes's eyes burned with a cold fire. He understood now that the cult leader's disappearance had not marked the end, but rather the beginning of a horrific chain of events that extended into the present day. The secret of the cavern lay in its role as the sacred, but deadly, site where the cult's rites were once held. Sweeping the flashlight across the stone walls, Holmes discovered faint traces of ash and barely visible footprints, evidence of long-forgotten gatherings. With a magnifying glass, he examined every detail, uncovering precise incisions in the rock, symbols used to channel dark energy in forbidden rituals. Deeper into the crypt, the air grew heavier. Holmes pulled a small oil lamp from his pocket and lit it. The dim flame illuminated faded murals depicting bizarre, half-human, half-beast creatures, including one that closely resembled the Christmas night monster spoken of in village lore. Holmes said to me in a somber voice, "This isn't just a cult. It embodies a transformative doctrine, a fusion of human souls with darkness from another world. That is the true origin of the supernatural events we're facing." A chill ran down my spine. All the rumors, the tales of monsters and shadows, could now be traced, at least in part, to the remnants of a forgotten sect. Holmes pressed on, discovering a narrow fissure deeper within the cave, leading to a sealed chamber below. Using a small tool, he pried it open. The sound of crumbling stone echoed hauntingly through the cavern. As the stone door creaked open, a rush of cold air burst forth, thick with the scent of smoke and sulfur. Holmes bowed his head, inhaled deeply, then withdrew an antique candle and placed it before the threshold. The flickering light revealed a stone table inscribed with complex glyphs. At its center lay a torn, ancient paper preserved beneath a layer of brittle glass. Holmes gently uncovered it and read aloud the faded handwritten lines. It was an oath, vowing that the soul of the lost one would be imprisoned forever in unending fire, never to leave the cavern on Christmas Eve, the night that marked the cult's downfall. Holmes looked at me. It was on that very Christmas night that the cult leader vanished. But perhaps he didn't die. He may still be imprisoned somewhere here, or part of his soul escaped, becoming the monster spreading terror. The darkness of history and its sinister rituals seemed never to have ended. And now, the evil of the past was returning in a new form, more dangerous, more terrifying. We stepped out of the cavern. Snow was still falling in thick, white sheets, covering everything like a nameless shroud. But deep down, I knew that the secrets of Grimswell's winter night were only beginning to be revealed. And that the hunt for the Christmas night monster would lead us into ever darker chapters ahead. Chapter 11, The Blood-Soaked Snowstorm. The silence of the white snow is not always a sign of peace, it can be a cold witness to tragedies gradually unfolding. Panic surged through the village of Grimswell as news spread about the kidnapping of young Thomas, the only child of the wealthiest family in town, who vanished without a trace on Christmas Eve. All eyes turned to Holmes, the only person who could help the villagers escape the nightmare closing in. Holmes stood on a high hill overlooking the village, his sharp gaze sweeping over each shuttered house where candlelight flickered behind small windows. He refused to let fear cloud the minds of these people. With a steady and persuasive voice, he reassured them, emphasizing that panic only empowers the enemy. Immediately, Holmes set to work arranging traps around the dense forest encircling the village. Under his command, the strongest men were divided into patrol teams, continuously watching with flashlights, ropes, and ingeniously crafted devices. Every tree branch and bush became a potential trap, waiting for the unseen foe. However, as night fell and the moonlight filtered through thick leaves, the traps were destroyed one by one, without any sign of captured prey. The monster appeared with strange cunning, swift as a ghost, leaving behind the unmistakable stench of sulfur and spots of ashes clinging to the snow. Watson reported back to Holmes with a tense expression, and I could clearly feel the exhaustion and pressure weighing on my dear friend. Holmes refused to be defeated. He knew that wisdom and perseverance would help find a way out of this thick darkness. Hasty footsteps in the forest, rapid breathing, and the pungent smell of burning smoke painted a terrifying picture, reflecting the danger lurking every moment. Holmes decided not to rely solely on physical traps but to also use his intellect to better understand the nature of their enemy. The villagers' fears had not yet subsided, many began discussing leaving to find safer shelter. But Holmes stood firm, promising them that justice and light would prevail over darkness. He placed his trust in close cooperation between humans and science rather than fleeing into hopeless shadows. The chase through the snowy night continued, the faint traces of the monster making everything even more mysterious and terrifying. Yet in Holmes's mind, even the smallest clues would gradually connect into a complete picture, and the truth would soon be revealed by the light of a new day. Chapter 12, Hellfire Beneath the Pine Tree. Fear does not arise solely from the unseen, but also from cunning schemes subtle enough to cloud reason. Amid the gloomy atmosphere of winter, Holmes stood silently before the ancient pine tree where the second corpse was discovered. The glowing embers scattered on the white snow looked like the mark of hellfire, emitting a distinctive sulfur scent that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. Holmes leaned in to examine every detail, his gaze piercing even the deepest hidden secrets. By analyzing the ash samples and remaining chemicals, Holmes confirmed the culprit was not a supernatural being. This was the work of human hands, using a special chemical compound that produced glowing red smoke and artificial sulfur smell to deceive the senses and spread terror. It was a scheme both sophisticated and cunning. Watson wondered if this was the act of a madman, but Holmes faced a more complex reality. The murderer was not merely an ordinary criminal but very likely a person who had lost sanity, fallen into a disturbed mental state, surrounded by the shadows of dark illusions. Holmes recalled the evidence gathered from previous scenes. Christmas wax fingers replacing human bones, a painting of a wolf-headed monster wearing a Christmas hat, and the reversed Christmas carol playing from the strange music box. All pieces formed a pattern of a dark ritual, an expression of mental disorder mixed with abnormal obsession. With deep understanding of human psychology, Holmes realized the killer was trying to create the image of a mystical creature to conceal their true identity, while also controlling the villagers' fears to manipulate them in one way or another. He decided to expand the investigation, focusing on individuals showing unusual signs in the village. Additionally, Holmes carefully sought out similar chemicals capable of producing effects like red smoke and sulfur scent to trace their manufacture and origin. Every clue, no matter how small, was weighed carefully by Holmes because he knew that between mystery and reality, the truth always hides beneath a shell of the unbelievable. Beneath the ancient pine tree, the flickering hellfire in the darkness served as a haunting warning of what still lay ahead. Mental disorder, chemical trickery, and dark rituals intertwined to create a complex picture that only keen insight and patience could unravel. The battle with darkness was far from over, and Holmes knew he must prepare for the terrifying challenges to come. Chapter 13, The Monster's Eyes in the Mirror. There are obsessions that cannot be erased. They seep so deeply that they transform a person into a ghost lurking within the shadows of their own mind. Holmes sat at his desk, the flickering light of an oil lamp illuminating the pages of notes he had carefully compiled over many days. Through a series of collected evidence and clues, he began to construct the psychological profile of the culprit, a person torn between sharp intelligence and the darkness of mental disorder. The murderer was not merely an ordinary criminal. He was a man of exceptional intellect, someone who had spent time under supervision in a mental hospital. But most striking was his extreme obsession with Christmas, a love so distorted that he believed the world could only be saved by recreating a pure Christmas, untouched by the sins and corruption of modern society. Holmes examined the bizarre details uncovered: wax hands replacing real fingers, religious symbols crudely slashed, classical music played in reverse, and a painting of a wolf-headed monster wearing a Christmas hat. All were elements of a strange ritual the killer had created to honor what he considered the holiest season. These rituals were not only manifestations of psychosis but also a way for him to build a private world where his own pain, trauma, and sorrow were transformed into brutal acts under the shadow of a Christmas that was supposed to bring joy and happiness. Holmes sketched the image of the culprit as a ghost in the Christmas night. A creature both intelligent and dark, carrying within him creativity and madness. He did not merely want to kill or spread fear. In truth, he sought to restore a version of Christmas that only he believed to be pure, intact, and meaningful. Watson watched Holmes with admiration, knowing that confronting such a cunning and mentally disturbed culprit was no simple task. This was not just a battle against a murderer but a confrontation with the hidden recesses of the human soul. Holmes decided he must delve deeper into the perpetrator's past, investigating the period of his confinement, those who had contact with him, and the events that led him down this path of madness. Every detail, no matter how small, could become the key to unlocking the terrifying mystery engulfing the village of Grimswell. With understanding and determination, Holmes prepared to enter a new phase of investigation. Not only following physical clues but also probing into the complex psyche of a man torn by blind love and utter insanity. The monster's eyes in the mirror were the reflected image of a chaotic, haunted soul on the verge of exploding in the cold Christmas night. Chapter 14, The Man Locked Within the Beast. There are dreadful secrets hidden deep in the darkness, waiting only for those brave and intelligent enough to uncover them. Holmes stood before a map detailed with notes on the victims and locations of the incidents, his sharp eyes scanning every smallest detail. After days of investigation and analysis, he had finally traced the identity of the one behind all this horror: Marcus Vellum, a former renowned psychiatrist and expert in the study of cults and mysterious beliefs. Marcus was once a respected figure in the medical field, but his spiritual and superstitious research had driven him into the abyss of madness. He believed that on Christmas Eve, when darkness and light merge, a mystical ritual could be performed to purify the soul, cleanse away impurities, and rebirth a new person, an immaculate saint. This belief turned Marcus into a fanatical zealot, willing to become the man locked within the beast, shedding his humanity to transform into a tool of dark faiths. The sacrificial rituals he meticulously planned aimed to collect enough souls deemed impure on Christmas night, thereby opening the door to the rebirth he longed for. Holmes saw not only cruelty but also a warped intelligence, a lost soul desperately trying to reconstruct meaning in life through the most horrific means. Marcus was not simply a murderer but an embodiment of fanaticism, a man torn between science and mysticism, between light and darkness. Step by step, Holmes prepared a plan to track Marcus, knowing this confrontation was not merely a hunt for a killer but a battle against the most dangerous superstitions of the age. Marcus understood human psychology and knew how to manipulate fear. He had turned the peaceful village into a haunted stage where madness challenged reason and the safety of the entire community. Watson stood beside him, feeling the heavy pressure of the task they bore. He understood that they were not only facing a criminal but also confronting the dark ghost of fanatic belief and grim delusion. This Christmas season, it would not be the twinkling lights or the ringing bells that would illuminate the truth, but courage, intellect, and steadfastness that would serve as the guiding torch. Holmes sighed, his eyes full of determination. The chase for the Christmas Eve monster was far from over, and now, they were closer than ever to the heart of the nightmare called Marcus Vellum, the man locked within the beast, about to reveal the full truth behind these dreadful secrets. Chapter 15, Hell's New Year's Eve. There are nights when the blizzard rages as if it wants to swallow the entire world, and it is in that dense darkness that nightmares truly take shape. Holmes and Watson stood silently amid the freezing forest, gusts of wind howling through the ancient pine branches like the sorrowful sighs of nature itself. The map in Holmes's hand had been carefully studied. Their ambush point was precisely where the most strange signs had appeared. Winter seemed to freeze every breath and every movement, sharpening every sound into a piercing note. The battle they were about to enter was not only a confrontation with a mysterious creature but a war between reason and chaos, light and darkness, survival and death. Holmes knew that every preparation had to be flawless, for their opponent was no ordinary mortal but a symbol of terror, masked in ivory-white wax, eyes glowing coldly, radiating a power beyond human comprehension. The silhouette of the monster moved silently through the thick snow, its body cloaked in jet-black fur, blending seamlessly into the night. Each step it took carried a dreadful sound, echoing through the silent space. The pungent smell of sulfur mingled with damp earth, signaling a storm of fury about to be unleashed. Watson strained his eyes, feeling each heartbeat pounding fiercely in his chest. The silence was suffocating, like the moment before a violent storm. Suddenly, the monster emerged from the shadows, lunging at incredible speed, razor-sharp claws threatening to tear apart everything in its path. Holmes reacted swiftly, wielding his long stick to strike back, the clashes echoing loudly in the cold snowy forest. But the enemy's strength and ferocity made the fight brutal. Every blow was met with a sharp and vicious counterattack. Watson suffered a deep wound in his shoulder, blood soaking through his thick coat, painful yet he stubbornly stood, continuing to support Holmes. Amid the swirling white storm, screams and crashing sounds filled the air dramatically. Holmes used all his experience and intellect to find the monster's weakness while protecting his companion from deadly strikes. This was no mere predator, it was the embodiment of fanatic belief, a nightmare forged by human hands. The battle dragged on until dawn approached, the snow ceased falling but the atmosphere remained thick with dread. Finally, the monster was defeated, its cold wax mask peeled away to reveal the face of a man full of pain and madness, someone once cast out by society. Holmes looked deep into those eyes and saw a soul yearning for salvation, but it was too late. That New Year's Eve night not only marked the end of a dark cycle but also opened a new chapter of unresolved mysteries, a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, small flames of reason and courage continue to burn bright, standing firm against evil. Chapter 16, The Mask Falls. Some truths only reveal themselves when the heavy veil of darkness, once carefully hidden behind layers of illusion and deeper shadows than the blackest night, is finally torn away. Holmes stood before the corpse of the monster they had just defeated in the cold snow. Without hesitation, he tore away the wax mask that the creature had used to conceal its true identity. Beneath the mask was the face of Marcus Vellum, the former psychiatrist who had descended into madness and barbaric crimes, turning Christmas Eve into a stage of horror. But the truth did not end there. Marcus, cruel and cunning as he was merely a pawn in the hands of another powerful figure who manipulated all events from the deepest shadows. The small wooden house nestled at the edge of the forest was considered the center of this story. A longtime villager, notorious for his eccentric behavior and seeming madness, suddenly revealed his true nature. People had always thought him insane, a hopeless superstitious fool, but Holmes had long been suspicious. Under the flickering light in the room filled with ancient symbols and talismans, Holmes discovered a faint clue. Inscriptions carved on the walls connected to the fire worshippers cult, which had been eradicated over 2 centuries ago. This villager, long shunned and mocked, was the last surviving follower of that cult. He had pretended madness to avoid detection and to continue his deranged plan to reenact a sacrificial ritual, fueled by the desire for a completely different Christmas Eve, a night of dark rebirth. Everything had been meticulously arranged down to the smallest detail, from the marks on the Christmas tree, the eerie sounds echoing in the wind, to the corpses bearing the distinctive signs of the Christmas wax ritual. Holmes observed and analyzed each detail, connecting seemingly scattered pieces to reveal a darker picture than he had ever imagined. Marcus was not just the executor, he was a puppet manipulated by the true mastermind behind the scenes, a figure who sowed terror through an undying heresy, using the weak and deluded as tools for his insane ambitions. The New Year's Eve ended not with the usual peace, but with the beginning of a new journey. Holmes knew the battle against darkness was far from over, and in that deep gaze, he prepared for the next steps, where ancient secrets would be unveiled, and forsaken souls would find rest. Finally, the mask fell, and the darkness was illuminated, if only briefly, enough to glimpse the truth behind every haunting shadow. Chapter 17, The Sealed Memories. There are memories not only forgotten but deliberately sealed away by time and by people themselves, leaving behind dark fragments that only the most persistent can trace to their very end. Holmes sat by the dim light of an oil lamp in his small study, placing Marcus Vellum's yellowed journal before him. The aged pages contained not only the story of a madman but also revealed a long, tragic saga tied to an entire community. Marcus was not born in darkness, he was created by it. The old villagers, the previous generation, had nurtured him with a dark purpose, turning him into the embodiment of a monster to guard a secret far deeper than anyone could imagine. The journal disclosed that Marcus was not merely a victim of abuse and superstition but the ultimate instrument in a plan to protect a priceless treasure buried beneath an ancient crypt deep underground. That treasure was not simply gold or jewels but contained the secrets of the fire worshippers cult, ancient knowledge and hidden powers so formidable that they inspired fear in anyone who learned of them. Holmes flipped through each page, eyes intently scanning the slanted lines of faded ink, aged by time but still conveying the despair and cunning in Marcus's mind. Each account was linked to rituals, sacrifices, and transformations that turned him into a creature no longer human. All of it was to keep the treasure's secret safe, preventing any outsider from infiltrating and seizing what belonged to the ancestors. Suddenly, Holmes paused at a particular page where Marcus described in detail a music box carefully preserved in the victim's house. The music box was not an ordinary object but the key to unlocking the door to deeper secrets. Holmes hurried back to the house to examine the music box they had previously found. Beneath the thick layer of wax coating the box, Holmes discovered a cleverly concealed map. The wax was not only decorative but served as protection, keeping the map hidden from prying and dangerous eyes. The map depicted tunnels and ancient crypts deep underground, pinpointing the exact location of the treasure that Marcus and the old villagers had strived to protect for generations. Studying every detail closely, Holmes felt the heavy responsibility weighing on his shoulders. Secrets buried for centuries could not be allowed to be exposed recklessly, yet the truth could no longer remain buried forever in darkness. He understood that uncovering this treasure would answer all the questions behind the recent bizarre cases but might also unleash unprecedented dangers. Watson entered the room, his eyes full of curiosity and concern as he saw Holmes engrossed in studying the map. They prepared for the perilous journey ahead, where they would face not only ancient mysteries but also those willing to protect the treasure with their lives. Before them lay dark tunnels, ghosts of the past, and mystical rites still echoing in the cold air. Each step deeper was a step into a world of sealed memories, waiting to be freed and the truth unveiled. Holmes and Watson's journey was no longer just about hunting a mad killer. It had become a confrontation with a dark past, where curses and ghosts had never truly departed but silently continued to influence the lives of the peaceful village they had long believed they understood. Chapter 18, The Blood Treasure of the Cult. Some truths hidden deep in darkness are not only secrets concealed but also dense bloodstains etched onto the cold stones of the past. Holmes and Watson stepped into the ancient crypt, the chill rising from the earth making the air heavy and oppressive. Before them lay a vast underground world, with old stone brick walls covered in moss and mildew. The flickering beam of their flashlight illuminated relics scattered over hundreds of years. This space held many mysteries, but what made Holmes stop was a large chamber sealed behind a heavy wooden door thick with the dust of time. When they opened the door, they faced a magnificent treasure few dared to dream of. Intricately carved gold bars piled shining brightly, alongside a collection of ancient artifacts bearing strange shapes. Each item bore ancient markings, once used in the rituals of the fire worshippers' cult, an order eradicated over 2 centuries ago. Holmes silently contemplated the terrible power this treasure and the relics could unleash if they fell into the wrong hands. He delved deeper into the notes found in Marcus's journal and other documents they had gathered on their journey. These objects were tools for the cult to manipulate the villagers through fear, enchantment, and to impose dominion across generations. Marcus Vellum, the man behind the monstrous face on Christmas Eve, turned out to be merely a pawn controlled by a far darker force. Holmes felt that Marcus had been exploited to cover up even more sinister schemes. What chilled Holmes most was not Marcus's madness, but the shadow of the one behind him, the silent puppeteer pulling every string of this deadly game. In Holmes's mind, a name began to emerge, a familiar face he had long suspected but never had enough proof to accuse. That person was the old village priest, who had avoided Holmes from the beginning, always trying to conceal every trace and secret behind his dark eyes. Holmes recalled every confrontation with the priest, his evasive answers, and uneasy gestures whenever the history of the fire worshippers' cult was mentioned. All those signs now became clearer than ever. The current parish priest was the mastermind behind everything, the true architect of the gruesome murders and savage rituals. Holmes decided they needed to confront the priest. But before that, he and Watson had to gather solid evidence to expose the true face of the man once revered by the villagers. Holmes quietly collected several relics, especially scrolls and items containing the cult's ancient writings, to shed light on the whole matter. Upon returning, Holmes wasted no time facing the priest. The priest's eyes were cold and calculating, lacking the friendly demeanor Holmes once knew. The confrontation was tense, every word felt like a dagger piercing the core of the hidden truth. The priest did not deny his role, he calmly confessed everything. His purpose was not only to protect the treasure but also to maintain absolute power over the village, using fear of the monster and occult rituals to manipulate the people. Holmes knew arresting the priest would be the first step to ending the long chain of tragedies. But he also understood that the village's deep darkness would not be easily dispelled, for beneath the truth lay wounds still bleeding, and ghosts that had never truly left. Holmes and Watson prepared to shine the light of justice on the darkest shadows of the village. Yet this battle had only just begun, and they would face greater challenges where each step might be their last in the relentless pursuit of truth. Chapter 19, The Spider Spinner. Some conspiracies are woven not only from hatred or madness but from a thirst for power, a desire to turn fear into a tool to manipulate every soul. In the dense darkness of the bitter winter, the light of faith becomes the sharpest weapon to maintain power and survival. Holmes stood face to face with the parish priest in the small room inside the church, where flickering candlelight cast shadows that made his face appear both gentle and full of calculation. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, each word carefully measured like the final pieces of a horrifying puzzle being unveiled. The priest slowly confessed everything. All the dreadful events that had occurred in the village were not caused by a real monster but by him creating a terrifying image, the Christmas Eve monster. Marcus Vellum was merely a tool, a puppet controlled and forced into a savage role to spread panic. The priest's deeper purpose was not just to stage a horrific scenario but to keep the villagers living in extreme fear, making them turn to him and the church as the only place capable of protection and salvation. This scheme was a sophisticated trap, turning fear into a guiding lamp, the sole light for the villagers to cling to. Holmes, with his sharp intellect and keen insight, gradually unraveled each layer of the web the priest had spun. From bizarre rituals, chemical traces producing red smoke and sulfur smells, to strange paintings, everything was part of a meticulously orchestrated plan designed to maintain absolute power. Watson watched all of this, his mind torn between astonishment and simmering anger. They knew this truth would shake not only the village but also the seemingly unbreakable faith held by its people. Finally, with irrefutable evidence in hand, Holmes and Watson took the next step, arresting the parish priest along with Marcus Vellum. The local police were mobilized, and the church doors quietly closed in the dim light of the cold winter afternoon. But Holmes felt no relief. He knew that the arrest was only part of a long journey ahead. The story still had many chapters unwritten, and the ghosts of the past lingered just beyond the light. The webs had been untangled, but who could be sure there were no other traps waiting to be set? Amid the shadows of spirituality, faith, and power, the path to justice is always fraught with danger and painful truths. The conclusion of this act did not come with victorious laughter but with a constant reminder that true light only comes from understanding and the courage to face the darkness within every human heart. Holmes, Watson, and the villagers would have to keep moving forward, steady and resolute, to write the next chapter of this never-ending story. Chapter 20, Case Closed, Dawn After the Snow. There are mornings when light seeps through every crack of the window, not only dispelling the darkness but also soothing the deepest pains of the soul. That Christmas morning, the snow stopped falling like a new promise, a fresh beginning that everyone in the small village had long awaited. A rare peaceful atmosphere spread across the snow-covered streets, where the frantic footsteps once left deep impressions, now replaced by sweet silence. For the first time in many months, the church bells rang out without accompanying screams, no longer the haunting echo of dark nights but a hopeful hymn of a new life. The villagers stood silently before the church, their eyes misty as the bell's chimes resonated like a message of forgiveness and comfort. Eyes once hardened by fear now shone with renewed faith, the light of truth revealed, driving away the ghosts of the past. Holmes and Watson prepared to leave the village, closing a chapter both dark and illuminating in their lives. On the train back to London, with the winter chill softly swirling smoke into the air, Holmes gazed out the window, his eyes deep yet calm, as if beholding a new horizon. He turned to Watson, his voice carrying profound reflection. The most terrifying foe was not the monster with claws and a waxen mask, but those who knew how to use belief to create such monsters, turning fear into a weapon to control minds and hearts. Watson fell silent, understanding that what they had witnessed was not merely a case, but a lesson about the dangers of blind faith and how belief can be exploited to sow terror. The small village could now begin anew, no longer shackled by darkness and sinister schemes. Christmas was not just a time of light and warmth, but also an occasion for people to learn to reconsider their faith. So they would never again fall victim to the ghosts they themselves had created. Holmes and Watson returned to London, carrying within them the story of a village that had weathered the storm of fear to welcome a new dawn. And so, their journey did not end there but opened a new horizon, where truth and intellect would always shine as guiding lights in this complex world.